Hello, everyone. Welcome. Warmest welcome. I see some people joining at the moment. So we're going to be pretending we have some elevator music as you continue joining. We are tremendously excited to be having you today. So probably we'll give you 1 minute to make sure people can join. We have an amazing registration rate and super excited to have you here. Well, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Excited to be here and to chat with you and with everybody. It's always fun to see the audience and all the different places they come from. So let us know in the chat where you're coming from. I always find it fascinating. You get so many people all over the world.
I love that part as well. Leave that in the chat. That's a great idea. Where are you coming from today? Nice. That's coming already. Such an international audience. Wow. Yeah, you're right. I'm very impressed. Cool.
Amazing what technology does today, isn't it?
Yeah, bringing us together. Absolutely. Look, I think it's time to kick off more formally. Welcome, everyone. We are very excited to have you today. Thank you for joining. As you know, today we're going to be tackling how to build a strategic finance function this budgeting season. We've been talking a lot about this. Budgeting season is here. Hopefully, you've been preparing accordingly. We said some time ago, winter is coming. It's prime season for you. It's the Super Bowl, really. So obviously very exciting, long hours, long weekends, but hopefully you are well prepared, to tackle it. It's also an amazing opportunity to shine and become more strategic and continue building. It's always a journey. This is strategic finance function, leveraging the Super Bowl prime time to become more strategic, and budgeting is that opportunity for us all. It's going to be alignment using strategic frameworks. Paul always comes very well prepared and is always super insightful. And, he'll be sharing best practices as to how to stay relevant for finance throughout 2025. Paul needs no introduction, the FP&A guy, but let me very briefly share with you. Paul Barnhurst, the FP&A guy, is joining us as usual. And we've had a number of these conversations. We've always had these amazing chats. Paul, I'm always learning from you. So super glad to bring the audience again in front of you for all of us to continue learning from best FP&A practices.
I'm excited to be here and just talk about it. FP&A is a fun area, and it's exciting how it's becoming more strategic and commercial every day, because to me, that's the fun part.
It's a privilege and a pleasure to be here. Thank you for joining us. And hey, most importantly, also for the audience, this is your conversation. This is your webinar. So don't let Paul leave without answering your questions, right? So please, any questions that you have, throw them into the chat, throw them into the Q&A section. Then we'll be allowing for wide time for Q&A at the end of the webinar. So make it useful for you, right? So this is mostly for you. Let's kick off, Paul. I'm equipped with some questions, so let me kick off. Maybe to break the ice, what role does planning ahead play in being strategic about the budgeting process? What's that preparation?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, planning ahead is very much tactical. A lot of people don't think, hey, how does that have to do with strategy? But if any of you have been part of a plan where either targets haven't been set ahead of time or you have a poor calendar, it's just a disaster. You're behind the 8 ball constantly. And I've been a part of more than one of those where you're just like, why did we do this to ourselves? So the more you really take that time, and often it's June, July, August, and really think through, what are all the meetings I need to have? What are all the templates? What's that detailed calendar look like? And the more cost centers, bigger the company, the more involved that plan can be, the smoother the budget process will go. the smoother it goes, the more you do up front, the more time you're going to have to be strategic, the more time you're going to have to think about things. Because I'm sure you've seen it, Julio. I know I have many times where you're just constantly behind the eight ball and you're just trying to get a number in. And sometimes, there's a couple things that happen. You make bad decisions. Two, you end up with these go find, stretch, whatever you want to call them. And you have a hockey stick at the end of the year and everybody's like, well, this is never going to happen. But you just throw it in because you got to get it done. And so I think the more you think ahead of time, the more it allows you to be strategic and do what's really important for the business's best interest.
Thank you so much for sharing, Paul. Absolutely. Preparation ahead of time, right? We see the SFP&A teams doing that and starting the budgeting season this amazing time of the year for us. Yeah, very well prepared. In that context, and with preparation top of mind, obviously data is key, and this is not only about financials, but all the business data that matters. So what role are you seeing in data and that collaboration with data teams? What's the role that you are seeing in data and collaboration with data teams when it comes to building a strategic finance function?
Yeah, so one of the first things, and I've heard this from a few different people in different ways, but one of the first ones I heard it from was someone by the name of Casey Wu. He's a not serial entrepreneur, but serial startup. He's worked for 5 or 6 different companies as CFO and CEO. And he made the comment that you can tell if you have a modern CFO by who owns data. And his point wasn't that, hey, finance should be 100% responsible for data, but the CFO has a vested interest. It is involved in the data and helping define the definitions of metrics and making sure that finance has access to that operational and financial data and is playing a role in it. And it's critical if you have a data department that they're involved. I've told this before, and I'm sure I'll tell it again. One of the last companies I worked for, we got a new CFO, and the first thing he did was move the data analytics team under finance, under his purview, so he could make sure it was all aligned. And I spent a lot of time working with them, with our sales ops and with our FP&A team. And so that first thing is it's just critical that you have that alignment and that you have alignment on metrics, not just who owns the data, but how do you define the data? I mean, how many of us have been in that meeting? I've been in more than one. It drives me crazy where it's like, where'd that number come from? I didn't sign up for that number. Nobody, that was finance that created that number. And then the rest of the meeting just devolves into pretty much a he said, she said waste of time. And so having that ownership of data is really important. And it goes beyond just who owns it. It also goes into the definitions. And then there's a whole process of making sure you have the right data and it integrates, which we could spend a whole webinar on, right? But at the end of the day, if you want a good plan, you need to be able to dig into the data to support your decisions. Without good data, without standard definitions, without everybody being aligned, it's almost impossible to really get a good budget that everybody's behind.
That's very insightful, Paul, as always. And let me very briefly add, I oftentimes see strategic finance teams also bring in the external data. So absolutely on the internal data and having access to all the metrics that matter, operational KPIs and financials. But they are also, very well versed in benchmark data. And of course, you collaborate with many initiatives out there that bring market data, for sector by industry, of course. And those are top of mind, and they are always offering those additional insights that make conversations more useful.
No, and I think that's a great point. One thing that's great, let's just talk benchmarking for a minute. If your competitors are public, it's so much easier to analyze their data today. Take their annual report, and have AI give you a summary. Use 3 or 4 different ones and get 80% of it done. Then go do the digging and add to it instead of just reading all of them yourself and doing all the work. So it's amazing how quickly you can start accessing things about industry, maybe questions to ask, getting started with using tools like generative AI to make that external research and analysis easier.
100%. Thank you. And AI is always, speeding this up as always. Good. Look, a follow-up question I have is if your budget process is mostly tactical, right? How do you begin the journey to making it more strategic?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts with leadership. So I'd ask you a question. I know you've been a CEO and a CFO. How do you ensure first that there's alignment between the executive team and finance? Because for me, that's where it starts. Is you
Yeah.
have to have that alignment, and then there's activities you can do, among the finance team to ensure the rest of the business is aligned. But how do you kind of as a CEO, or you can speak as a CFO? I know you've had both roles. How do you ensure that alignment's there?
So an important part for me is as a CEO, as a CFO, that you're thinking about giving access to your FP&A team to the top decision making. And it sounds very obvious, but hey, we still find in companies that FP&A teams don't have like direct access to CEO or even board level conversations that are very relevant for them to then go and think a strategy. When it
Mhm.
The framework of today's conversation is the budgeting season, right? And budgeting is nothing more than translating strategy into numbers, translating strategy into a operational plan in my mind. And I want to double click on that later today. And and I'm very passionate about this topic. And if FP&A teams first don't have access to top decision making, and they have always this intermediary conversations where they go and try to have a meaningful conversation with the CRO or with the CPO, but they were not at the table. Like, yeah, you're lagging behind, right? So fight for that, sit on the table. I think that's very important. I think a couple of other topics that ensure that full alignment with the strategy is that proactivity in shaping the strategy, right? So oftentimes we see finance teams, FP&A teams, hey, running a bit headless to pull the numbers, right? So you are spending many hours behind the desk, building that model, and then another version of the model, and another version of the model, and then running up and down to get some numbers and plug them in and sharing versions and all that mess, right? And is that your highest leverage in the company? Like, do you maybe want to be more proactive and go out there and start having more meaningful conversations with your stakeholders? And there is this other topic we will talk about, which is business partnering. But, you know, that proactivity in trying to shape the strategy, in trying to have those meaningful conversations is absolutely critical. So this is what I see, best FP&A teams shine.
Yeah, and I love how you said having access to the senior leaders and understanding those discussions. I worked for a company, we got a new CEO. We'd gone through a hard time. It was one of the first meetings, and he was just very transparent with us. And there's a couple things that stood out as one, he shared, hey, the company as a whole, we're growing revenue, but we're growing expenses faster than revenue. And we are a mature industry. That's not a long-term sustainable method, right? Startup, that's a different story in some situations. And then two, he actually admitted this at one point, which I thought was very telling. But I tell this because this company had very tactical budgets, and you can see why. He admitted to everybody, he goes, if anyone's seen our strategy, let me know. I've been here 3 months and I still haven't been able to find it. Just speaking to how lack of any kind of coherent strategy in the company, how everything was tactical. And it was always so hard to do planning and get people aligned and have it be efficient because there wasn't a clear strategy. And so you didn't have people on the same page. And if you can't get people on the same page, your budgeting process often just becomes a finance exercise where people submit numbers, everybody does what they're going to do and hopes they hit the target instead of having all that aligned downstream. So it was a real kind of eye-opening moment when he said that. I mean, we all chuckled, but it really made sense to me. I could go, okay, makes a lot of sense of why it's so frustrating the way this finance department works.
Love that story, and hey, love how you think of hoping for hitting the number. Really,
Yeah.
right? That's sometimes the outcome. Good. I think maybe if we want to go back to the topic of maybe we have some people in the audience today that they feel their budgeting process, they're trying to become more strategic, but potentially they are a bit more tactical today, right? And they feel more, plugging some numbers than having strategic conversations and talking to the CEO. So if that's the end state that we all want to have, how do we start moving more from tactical to strategic budgeting?
Yeah, so I think there's a first thing. It starts with, I'd say there's two things your finance, your FP&A team has to have. As we talked about, you have to understand what the strategic goals are. You have to be comfortable with those and understand them so you can have conversations when you're building the budget to make sure it ties back to the company objectives. With that, you have to understand the business. It's really hard if you're a finance person and all you understand is the financial numbers. In fact, it's virtually impossible to have a strategic conversation and really align the business. So I think that's the first thing, is that clear understanding of the strategic goals, understanding of the business. Then from there, you got to get down to some practical steps. I think first, you have to make sure you understand the operational metrics that drive your business, because finance metrics are not leading indicators. They're just not. I can't think of any that you really are the first thing you're going to look at to understand a business. You might be looking at, NPS or leads generated, qualified leads, calls made, hits on a website, whatever it may be. There's a lot of different metrics depending exactly on your business that are going to help drive your revenue. You need to make sure you understand those. You're building those into your model so that you can ensure that there's a way you can hold the business accountable to whatever the targets are that you've built strategically. And then I think the next step with that is, if you got those operational drivers, then is flowing that down as you have conversations with business. It's key that none of this is done in a silo. You're talking to the business as you do it. And then, okay, you've come up with those financial numbers. Make sure with the sales team, what does that mean for quota? What does that mean for the calls we're going to make? What's the head count you have to have? And how are your operational plans aligned with the financial? Because I've seen times where, the operational and the financial are not aligned, whether it's quota, whether it's how they're going to get there. And the more you can have that aligned and have those conversations, the better you're working to achieve it as a team. I think another important kind of simple thing is sometimes just changing perspective to be more strategic. I've seen some companies where finance is like, you missed your numbers. It's we missed our numbers. That's a slight little nuance, but it makes a difference because it brings in that business partnering and that collaboration. And yes, that's not strategy, but that's part of culture and making sure everybody's on the same page, which if you're on the same page, it makes it a lot easier to focus on the strategy versus if you get into any of that us versus them. And, we'll talk more about that with business partnering. The other is make sure you understand the why and the what behind the numbers. A great framework for that, I often use it with variance commentary, is the what, the so what, and the now what. So what is, okay, what's the numbers behind the plan? But the so what is, well, why is that important? So what does that mean for the business? What does that mean to the strategy? And the now what is, how do we ensure that's implemented? Okay, we've put the numbers in here. Are we comfortable we actually have the qualitative plan behind that? And so I think that's really important. And then the last one I'll add, and this gets into budget, but it also goes throughout the year, not just budget, but make sure each investment case, you're analyzing it both quantitatively and qualitatively. And I'll share two examples, one a little bit more from a qualitative or quantitative standpoint and one from the other, qualitative. Well, when I worked at American Express, I remember we had our CFO in town for our business travel, and she was meeting with one of our senior leaders, and he had this new idea, and he'd put down all these numbers and what we're going to achieve. And she spent an hour with him and went through it all and said, okay, the business idea is good. These numbers are garbage, basically, much nicer than that. But just walked him through why they made no sense strategically, not strategically, but from a finance perspective, like the market's not big enough to support that. Here's our share. We couldn't achieve that. Here's what we could achieve. And let's work toward that as an investment case. So making sure it was very realistic. On the qualitative side, the example I like to share is one of the first articles I ever wrote back in 2016 or 17 was how strategy is the hidden skill for FP&A professionals. And I shared an example of some companies where finance should have had a bigger voice to say these were bad ideas. And one of the prime was a company I worked for, American Express. They launched a large enterprise growth division, and they launched some products called Serve and Bluebird. They were for the unbanked and underbanked. If you think of American Express, does anyone think of unbanked or underbanked, or you think of the black card premium customers spending a lot of money? They didn't have the infrastructure to support a low-cost customer service model, and it was a disaster. It went away in a few years, and you could see it qualitatively by just going, this doesn't align with our strategy. This isn't our core competency. And you can see it quantitatively in below average returns in the P&L, frankly, losing money for the entire life of it, and they sold it off to another company. And so those are the type of things that we need to be able to look at and help the business realize, because it's so easy to get caught up in chasing growth and we'll figure out the bottom line later. And that can be a really dangerous situation. And that often happens during budget season when we don't have the numbers we want.
Well, thank you so much. This is precisely why I love these conversations with you. But it's super insightful, and a couple of things. So one is absolutely on having a more well-rounded view as to how things are going to evolve from a full P&L perspective. So of course we have some growth aspirations, and then we might have some hope to on more basis to achieve those numbers. But we see oftentimes even our customer base before adopting certain technologies that they don't have full visibility about cost allocation, maybe. Right? So maybe they expand into new markets with certain products only to, 12, 18 months later, realize they lost out of money. Right? So how are you doing shallow P&Ls by product, by customer segment, and how do you get smart at it as a finance team to drive those more meaningful decisions? So thank you for sharing those, how you challenged in the past certain decisions and saw that happening in amazing companies. Let me bring up, I think, a question from the audience, actually, that feels very relevant. And Rafael is asking, how can we break the habit of leadership carrying over last year's numbers into the new year's budget, even though the strategy has changed drastically?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd love to know a little bit your thoughts on that too, Julio, but I'll share my thoughts. Thanks, Rafael. I think first, this is where it's good to do some kind of bottoms up exercises as a business, where you go to business leaders and what's the target you believe you could achieve next year? Or even if there's a target there, what do you need to achieve it? Because, right, the board, senior leadership, they're always going to have some targets. There's been long range planning. They're going to have an idea where they want to be. You need to make sure you can have the drivers and the detail to say, here's where we can get, and here's what it will take to get to that next number. So you can have a meaningful discussion. Because what almost always happens, top down, you get a target here. Bottom up, you get a target here. They're not the same. There's almost always a gap. And that's when the fun begins and the negotiations. And you have to be real careful. One of my favorite examples is there was a CFO. CEO said, I need you to take all these numbers. And the CFO and the general manager looked at him and basically just said, no, it's not achievable. We won't take them. You can find someone else to run the business. And not saying we need to be that aggressive, but they made it very clear it wasn't possible. And the CEO, unfortunately, went to a CFO of another division. He was new and just took the whole thing. And that plan was a disaster. I came in after the plan had been built and had to report to the global CFO every month that we were way short of our numbers. It was not fun. So there's a certain level of doing your homework and then also pushing back, but pushing back in a way of here's what we can achieve or here's what we need, not just no, that's not possible and we won't do it. Nobody wants to hear that from finance.
100%. Nothing really to add, actually, because, Rafael, I think the magic happens when bottoms up meets top down, right? And maybe in certain positions, it's very easy to think, we want to meet these objectives. This is top-down planning. Next year, let's add this percentage of growth, or we need to go through our next series of fundraising, and then therefore I need to multiply revenue by this, or like God knows what, it's driving really that number. But it's not very useful, right? If you think of it. So it's a guiding principle. It's ambitious. It's going to be a challenge for the business, but really you need to, and it's FP&A's responsibility to be more bottoms up, and realize what is the foundation, what's the confidence of the real business. Do we have the resources? Do we have the talent density? Do we have what we need to get there? And if there is a gap, okay, let's have that negotiation, as you said, or let's actually put a serious plan in place to actually hit that number, and let's have that conversation beforehand. Otherwise, we're just hoping throughout the year that we're gonna hit that, and that you're leaving things to chance.
And I'll add one little thing. It's my partner always teaches this, Ron Montero, when we talk about budgeting. He says, make sure you have an idea of what the targets are before you start from leadership. Have those conversations early. He goes, it was always so helpful versus me doing everything. And then at the end, we're rushing to try to figure out how we get there. So you can give the business some idea. This is where we want to achieve. Even if their bottom up comes short of that, they'll at least have ideas, those risks, those opportunities that might help close the gap versus you get all done. Then you figure out the target, you're way short and you're freaking out. It's much better to make sure you have those conversations early with leadership to get an idea. Because I remember one business where we kept asking leadership and they wouldn't give us numbers. It was very, very frustrating. The VP asked multiple times. We got all done, and then they decided we need to cut all the expenses, and we just did it across all the cost centers, and nobody recognized their numbers, and nobody was happy with the budget. And it was a mess.
I can imagine how big of a mess that was. Good. Awesome. Let me jump into the next question after covering this from the audience. We have some more questions from the audience, but then we'll cover some of those later. A question that I have for you is why having a tech stack that works for you is so important to be strategic during the budgeting season.
Because I like to sleep. I mean, I say that jokingly, but I worked at one company where we had horrible systems. It felt like it was the 90s or 80s, and this was in the 2010s. And so it was very painful. And I spent an inordinate amount of time cleaning data, transforming data, building it in such a way that I could hold the business accountable. And so one of two things happened. I either worked a crazy number of hours, or I had to let the strategic go, or I had to let the data go. Neither of those are ideal situations. Those all lead to optimal outcomes, whether in your personal life, because you sacrifice it for work, or whether in your work life, right? There's not a way to balance that. So having good technology, the key to that is it frees you up to focus on what's important. But what's so important to remember, it isn't so much good technology. Like, Abacum is a great tool. There's a lot of great tools out there, but there is not a right tool for everybody. It's people, making sure you have the right people. And generally your teams are going to be good enough, but making sure you have the right strategy, goals, alignment behind them, you have a process mindset. Then when you bring in the technology, it can allow you to accomplish a lot more. And it doesn't always have to be a big, huge project. There's little things you can do. Like for me, a game changer was just learning Power Query to help me clean up data instead of trying to do it all manually or with formulas. It could start with baby steps. And the biggest thing that does is it then frees you up to focus on what's important, because we've all been stuck in spreadsheet or Excel hell before. Everybody's dealt with it if they've worked for a company of any size. And at some point, it gets to where that just slows you down, doesn't make you flexible, doesn't make you adaptable, which you have to be strategic, not just for budget, but for rolling forecasts. I mean, think back to COVID. How many of you scrapped your budget? I would guess every hand goes up, right? Maybe one or two of you didn't and had to rebuild it. Very common. And so you got to have good tools to be able to do that. Otherwise, you get stuck in that tactical cleaning data all day.
Well, thank you so much. And let me follow up with a question from the audience. I think it's very relevant for what you just said. And I don't want to open the Pandora's box, but yet I might. So how can we employ the AI tools, I guess AI in general, especially the latest Gen AI, for process improvement? how else can we increase accuracy rates?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI in general, and I think it's important to break it apart a little bit. There's machine learning, there's generative AI, there's robotic process automation. A lot of these things have been in place for years. So when it comes to budget and forecasting, I still think in general, machine learning is probably what most people are using. Yes, Gen AI is getting the part where it can build some forecasts and it can help you even implement machine learning and those things. Where I think Gen AI's strength is at the moment is really helping us to be creative, think through processes, write formulas, anything that's tactical to get us started. So, a great example, let's say we want to do process improvement. Tell AI about your business and ask it to give you a potential process map, or load if you have a process map and you have access where you're not worried about security or data. I always emphasize that. Make sure, it's a private model or you're giving it dummy data, but give it a process map and ask it to analyze it. It will give you ideas. Is it going to get you 100% of the way there? Pretty much never. But it's like an intern. And the example I'll give of just how much it can help is we have this budget exercise we give to people who take my best practice FP&A course. And I showed them after they spent 45 minutes working on it, we loaded it in AI, the exact question in the data, and it had an answer that was probably as good as the students in about a minute and got them 80% of the way there. I'm waiting for the day when somebody does that in the course. And then you'll see a much better presentation at the end because they let it get the thinking and the process started and did a lot of the stuff that we would do that's just very straightforward. And so I think the key is asking it questions, learning to use it with generative AI, help you to be creative. One of the best I've heard comes from Jim O'Neill. I really liked his idea, a company called SaaSworks, where he worked for HubSpot as the CTO, and he said, have it be a contrarian. Ask it what's wrong with this process, or what's wrong with the strategy, or how can I improve it? He said he's found it's incredibly good at doing that kind of thing. So those are a few thoughts, but I think right now it's great for the transcribing, the summarizing, the challenging, and it's getting better on the forecasting. It's good for what kind of graph to use, but garbage in, garbage out data. And it's not at the point where I'd be comfortable saying, hey, just build my forecast when it comes to generative AI, for sure.
100%. It's a very relevant question, and something that we know is that Gen AI is not yet mature for numbers, right? And this is just so still you can try to use it to triangulate and to help you with the forecast, but generally speaking, if you have relevant volumes of data that span out for a number of years, probably machine learning is going to be way more helpful.
100% agree.
So that's still the very reality. That doesn't mean this is not going to change very fast. So, maybe in 12 years or 12 months, 18 months, as OpenAI deploys more new versions, like maybe 5.5, maybe the 6th version of ChatGPT, probably then we'll get, they say, we hear the maturity with numbers will arrive. But today it's not yet there. So it's useful to triangulate, but usually what we see people using in our platform at least is, of course, their own drivers. They triangulate that with ML driven forecasting. And then, you can also triangulate with AI. Reality is less accurate. So
agree. About 6 months ago, I talked to Justin Croft. He wrote an article on AI and planning, an expert in the area. And he said the reality is most of their clients, when it comes to planning and budgeting, are using machine learning. Very few are really using generative AI. Learning models are not ideal for math problems. You have code interpreter and different things to overcome it. And two, like I said, vast volumes of data, often giving that to the tool may not be the right thing to do. So we're not there for it doing forecasting and budgeting, but it can definitely help with a lot of things.
100%. So probably this will change, but for the time being, stick to your good old machine learning, algorithms, and those are very helpful, and we see that in our customer base. hope this was helpful. No worries. We'll be sending a recording of this later on, as I'm seeing some question related to this in the chat. Please don't be shy. Continue sending your questions here. Good. Paul, let me move towards, and we touched on this a little bit before. I'm also, happy to provide some thoughts later on, but, what roles operational data play in being strategic, right? Which might seem counterintuitive, but, what do you see best FP&A tips do?
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is your business speaks operations, not financial numbers. Financial numbers are a language to allow us to keep score, so to speak. They allow us to track performance, but they don't allow us to operate the business. And at the end of the day, building a budget, being an FP&A and a finance department, our goal is to help the business make better decisions. We have to understand the operations and use operational data. It really is as simple as that. I know that sometimes people are like, well, what are all the steps? And it starts with knowing what the key indicators are. And I say key because so often we track everything, and that's fine. We may want to track everything, but you shouldn't be making your decisions looking at everything. You're going to find conflicting numbers in there. What are the 3 to 5 things that tie back to the strategy, and that if we accomplish, we have a high chance of achieving our strategy? Those are the first metrics you should really understand, and make sure you understand the drivers behind them. And a driver value tree is a great way to do that. Take revenue and break it apart into each component and work your way back so that you understand the flow and how it works. And then take that and build that, whatever that is, into your model. It may be website, it may be customer calls, foot traffic. I mean, there's hundreds of different things it can be, because there's as many different types of revenue as there probably is revenue models when you start thinking about it.
Thank you so much for those thoughts, Paul. Love how you are presenting this, and thank you, JK and others for these questions. We'll make sure to allow some time towards the end to cover them. A question I had as well was, what are, in your opinion, some of the main differences between someone that is strategic in FP&A and someone who is not?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key difference, I'd say there's a couple things. Number one is, if you're going to be strategic, you're spending time with the business. You have to be a business partner. It starts with the business, because you understand the operations, you understand the business. 2, you can bring it up to a high level. That's an area I've really struggled with my whole career. I mean, I've gotten in trouble from more than one leader for being too detail-oriented. And it's great to get into the details, but you have to bring it back up and have that strategic discussion. You have to be able to step away from the numbers and be that business partner. I think when you really know you're strategic, and I remember a partner of mine, again, I'll go back to Ron Montero, my training partner, he shares, and I have a similar story, where he had a business partner that wouldn't make any big decision without him in the room that impacted the company financials. He is a strategic partner if that's how his general manager looks at him. And that's the way you can gauge it. Do they want you there for the important discussions? Are they telling you about things and having the discussion ahead of time? Or are you finding out they spent $500,000 after the fact and you're scrambling to fix your budget? That's obviously you're not being strategic. The other one I'll share is, I had a general manager who came to me one day, and this is probably the greatest compliment I've received in my career, is he looked at me and he goes, Paul, you don't just report the P&L, you help shape the P&L. You're helping drive the bottom line results. I think that's how you can tell if you're being strategic. Yes, you can analyze things with frameworks, and you can do all kinds of different things. But I think if you want to boil it down to really being a great business partner, the business wants you to be there, and you're helping them make better decisions and impacting the overall results.
I love it. Driving the P&L, right? I think this is our vocation in FP&A and in finance. And this is what justifies and what correlates to our highest leverage and impact. And something I think a lot about and talk a lot about with our customers is, we are here to drive performance, to generate enterprise, right? And this is the core of it. Like, we are here to generate enterprise value, and we do that through obviously data that informs better decisions that are that enterprise value. We are equipping teams through business partnering to make better decisions that generate enterprise value. And therefore, we are guiding people as to, I'm super optimistic with our growth in that region or in whatever. And then with data, we can guide better decisions and say, hey, like maybe this product is better suited because it's more profitable. So having granular data, unit economics by customer, by product, by region, by segment, whatever. So that's very important. Like, developing this mindset of I'm here to drive performance. And actually something that you've mentioned before, Apollo, which is holding the business accountable, driving performance and accountability. So access to all the wealth of operational KPIs, having them ready at your fingertips, and ensuring the business is delivering. And it's not that you're a policeman, right? It's not that we become like this, the bad cop there to. But we need to hold the business accountable. Like, we've agreed on delivering on certain things, and then we are missing targets or we are overachieving. So it's, as you said, collective, but holding the business accountable, making sure the whole leadership team, each relevant stakeholder is exposed to performance, and that we know why we deviate and why variance exists.
Yeah, and I'd love to ask you a question or two, kind of as we've talked about all this. So from your perspective as the CEO, what are the signs to you that your finance department is strategic? Obviously, you mentioned we've talked about a few things, but are there one or two key things that you look for to say, yep, they're really helping drive the strategy, they're thinking strategically?
So to me, the key aspect, especially connected with the budgeting season, right, that we're discussing today, is if they manage to make budget the operational plan for the year, and that if they are crafting the budget in a way that will drive agility and will turn into reforecasting during next year. So that is in essence something that during budgeting season tells me if a finance team in our customer base or our finance team is FP&A team is actually at the core of the strategy. So is your budget like this, numbers that you fought for and you sort of connected, and then everybody seemed to give it a lot of importance, and then the board at some point approves, and you know what, like nobody really cares. Like, it happens, right? Like, it happens. Then during the year, like, how are we tracking against budget? But it's not at the center of the conversation, because the conversation goes then towards other spreadsheets, other forms or instances. And then what people follow is more maybe Salesforce data or whatever, right? So the conversation is not in around the budget, but it's more about, tracking sales or tracking that. Look, when you are at the center, your budget is structured and done in a way through business partnering and through other things that it becomes your operational execution plan. And that's very important. Budgeting is your operational plan. So I sometimes don't even like budgeting as a word. Like, I think more of an operational plan. So this is what structure my capital allocation for next year. And I know that probably month 2, month 3, the latest, I'm going to be wrong. So then I want to stay agile, right? So obviously I'm going to stay, that budget, I have that deviation, but through the process of discussing capital allocation and resource allocation, we got better as a team. We have more information. So it's more the process than the outcome. And then during the year, so what's critical is during 2025, that budget becomes your monthly forecasting or reforecasting. And maybe you don't want to reforecast in January. Hopefully you don't need that. But hey, like probably in March, you want to start driving that agility into the business so that budget in the form of a forecast now stays current and continues to get updated and continue decisions and capital allocation. So, and unless our finance teams, if our finance team or in our customer base, if they are not achieving that, we have room to grow, to become more strategic and more impactful in the business. So
yeah, I agree with you. I think that's well said. And I love how you said operational plan. Just remind people it should be a playbook, as you said. I've heard it once said, salespeople have their playbook, it's their commission plan, and they're going to work it. If you do it right, your employees are going to work that operational plan or that budget to help you achieve it.
Love it. So one question regarding scenario planning. You and I have spoken extensively about this. And how do you think a scenario planning is key and a key part of being strategic during budgeting?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of versus scenario planning is scenario management, because so often what happens is people think sensitivity analysis or just looking at it in different cases is enough. There needs to be thought behind those scenarios. Let's take an example. We can't predict when a black swan will happen, but we know one's going to happen. You could have a scenario that says, okay, if a black swan happens that impacts us negatively or positively, what do we do? And how do we know that's going to happen? Or government regulation. There should be some thought behind that recession of what the most likely scenarios are and what's the plan and how do we know to change direction? Because if all you have is the scenarios, you've really just, and you never do any kind of the management and the process beyond just building some scenarios, you've kind of just done different sensitivity analysis with maybe a little more work, but you're not using it to help guide the business, right? You need different thoughts behind that help you know when to implement it. The best businesses are ones that have had different scenarios. They've mapped those out and they have a plan of what to do if they see that happening. So they see maybe some macro environment things going on that makes them know, hey, this is happening. We should now change our decisions and think differently and start to follow this plan. Or, yep, it looks like that rule is going to be put in place. It's going to substantially change regulation in my industry. We need to act differently now. So there needs to be action. It can't be enough to just have scenarios or have more than a point estimate.
Well, thank you so much. Scenario planning is so critical, right? And, but anyway, let me jump into questions from the audience before I get too excited about doing a scenario planning and the scale and everything we should all be doing during budgeting, really. So
agree.
Logan has a great question here, which I feel is a classic. For budget, there is always a V1 and then a scrap adjustment, right? Like I've been there. I feel for you, Logan. So stakeholders sometimes get disengaged, and they do actually, as they try to protect their budget numbers, which is very common. How do you keep partners engaged during the tough scrubbing cutting process of the budget?
I'll share a couple thoughts. One, I think it comes down to you got to have a good relationship. And what that means is, if you've ever heard of the term emotional bank account when it comes to business partnering, we all have withdrawals and deposits in our own bank accounts, and you want to have more deposits than withdrawals. Finance by nature has more withdrawals than most businesses. We often have to be police. Sometimes we have to say no. We're often reporting news that is bad. So you, before the budget, you need to have built up some deposits and have that good relationship so that they can trust you and stay engaged. Now, sometimes you're going to lose them and you may have to have a frank conversation with them. There isn't a magic bullet of something you can do. That's part of the process. So that's one thing you can do, is making sure that emotional bank account. Some other things that companies have tried of some of these ideas of beyond budgeting, where you try to separate the forecast from the allocation process and your targets. So you try to separate them so you don't have game playing. You build the best forecast you can, but you allocate the resources as needed based on those projects, where the forecast is just, let me see how accurately I think I'm going to be. And then the target is kind of set separate so that they don't play the game of, well, I'm going to go in and get as much as I can, or I'm going to sandbag or whatever. And there's different ways that can be done. Rolling forecasts can help with the accuracy of ongoing, but some of those type of things are important to try to change sometimes a little bit of the game playing, the rules, so to speak, so people don't play games with the budget. Because how many of us have been there? I mean, if we're honest, we probably have all seen the game playing. I've done it. I mean, I'll be fully transparent. So those are a few thoughts. I don't know if you have anything you'd add, Julio, but those are a couple of my thoughts.
Definitely, you want to have that strong relationship that is built on confidence and trust, and they understand you are in there for them. Um, Other than that is, I found that in the past actually very difficult. Um, if if they see that all the time the conversation is gonna be, you are there with the scissors. So that is very classic. So sometimes it's giving them a pass. Sometimes is actually being proactive when it matters, right? So I think that actually in finance, when you have an understanding, for instance, and we have that conversation, right? Actually internally, okay, we have this amazing acquisition channel. And then we realize we're actually underinvesting, right? So it's fantastic when finance spots that and says, guys, like your budget is increased. Like the conversation is not about reducing the budget. So once you have that credibility in the business that you are actually a good resource allocator and you care about it and you are fair, then maybe the conversation is but yeah, Logan, I think it's human nature as well to protect territories, right? So
yeah, we all do it.
so Jake has another amazing question. Any trade-offs you've had to factor in for successful business partnering, also to align operational and financial strategies?
I mean, I think when I think of trade-offs, there's first just the trade-off of time allocation. Sometimes you have to push back at corporate and say, look, I need more time to be that business partner, to align with the business and to focus on what's important. I've delivered more than one forecast late because I was working on critical things for the business. And I've never once had the CFO or my boss tell me, no, drop that. Don't take care of our business and get this budget in that's or forecast in most cases that's arbitrary, right? There's almost always some time in that. So I mean, I think that's one thing. Second, in trade-offs, I don't know if it's making trade-offs to be a successful business partner. It's building trust, having their intent. So I think I wouldn't call it a trade-off, but it's focusing on the business instead of yourself. So if you have an intent of how can I make the business be better, promotions will take care of themselves. Where if your intent is how can I get promoted, people recognize that. And then as far as aligning operational and financial, you're going to make trade-offs in the numbers, but it's not so much about trade-offs. It's about open conversation and making sure everybody's aligned and then on the same page. And if trade-offs have to happen in the numbers, that you have transparent conversations around them.
Thank you so much, Paul. Let me bring up some other questions from the audience. I'm very excited about this engagement. How much is it important to consider macroeconomic factors while drafting a budget?
Some of this you have to know your business. I mean, obviously you need to look at the world trends and think, how can those impact things? And if there's something that you feel confident enough to put in your budget, great. Obviously, inflation is something you're going to have to do. Currency, there are things like that. At the end of the day, we can't control the macro environment. If we could, we probably wouldn't be working in the role we're working in, right? We can't control who's going to go to war, what dock workers are going to go on strike and when, and all those type of things. So what we can do, though, is ask ourselves, what happens if those type of things that are material to our business happen, that we think there's a possibility? We're looking out and seeing what people are saying and understanding. We can do some scenarios around that. We're never going to do all of them. You pick a couple that you think are most likely and have a plan around that. Beyond that, I think the 80 is focusing on your business to be the best and to execute as best as it can. Well, at least keeping your eye on the macro and having an idea of what you're going to do if certain things happen. That's kind of my thoughts. I mean, obviously there is some high level, but if you start trying to figure out all the macro factors, you're going to drive yourself crazy. There's a reason if you ask 4 economists, you get 5 opinions.
Yes. That's an excellent answer. Let me go for another question. Katharina is asking, um, can you give some tips on how to ensure that the budget remains relevant when there is uncertainty in the market?
Yeah, I mean, the key is to have rolling forecasts. And at the end of the day, sometimes the budget is no longer going to be relative. And if that's the case, you got to realistically have that conversation. Like after COVID, many people's budgets just weren't relative. That's the truth, as we talked about earlier. So one, you need a process that's adaptable. You need technology that allows you to quickly close the book, to do rolling forecasts, to let the business what's going on regularly so you can adjust. You need to look at the budget as a planning process and then be adaptable and adjust throughout the year instead of looking at the budget like a Bible that no matter what, these are the numbers and we have to hit them. Because nobody hits their numbers. You may be over, you may be under, but I would love to know if anyone's exactly hit all their numbers. If they have, we're going to Vegas. Just give me a call. Right. And so it's the process and then being adaptable and flexible that's important. And that's why having the strategy, being strategic, being operationally focused is so important because you're never going to hit the numbers. And it's not about the budget numbers. It's about the planning and helping make better decisions so you're moving in the right direction.
That's very interesting and so true. One maybe almost last question. Let's see if we can squeeze one more in. Also coming from Logan, it's more strategic in nature, right? Strategy to me has always been defined as where do we want to compete and how do we want to win, right? This is a very by book definition. Do you think you can take a similar approach for internal budgeting and planning?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can. You can obviously talk about where do we want to win? Here's our strategy. We know we want to win here. What does that mean for our team? And what does that mean in our planning process? You know, one of the definitions I've heard for strategy too that I really like is strategy is about closing doors. You're going to have more opportunities than are available to you. And I see Julio nodding his head, having started a startup. I'm sure you've had 10 or 15 different directions you could go. It's like, what makes sense? Where should I take the business? I'm dealing with that right now in my own business where I get so many different opportunities. Like, does this make sense? So you can do that within the budgeting process because there's going to be more investments and opportunities than make sense. So go back to your strategy and say, how does this budget, how do these decisions help us win? How do they align with what we're trying to accomplish? And if the answer is no, then you got to ask, does this make sense? Should we be submitting something different? You got to have those hard conversations because everybody wants growth, but often that growth comes at a cost that may not make sense. And it's finding that right balance because those are really hard conversations to have with investors when it doesn't make sense. And that's where it's critical that you've partnered, you've done your homework, you have the data and the options to support why you're saying, hey, this may not help us win.
I love it, right? Because as you said, it's about closing doors, and I think finance and FP&A teams have an amazing opportunity to drive that focus on what matters in the business, right? FP&A is not the sole owner of a strategy, of course, no, right? So
Yeah.
Another stakeholder in that conversation, and then hopefully we as a team have meaningful conversations and collectively drive a good strategy that is focused. What FP&A teams and finance teams can really do is to ensure that people have all the information that matters to and craft a powerful, meaningful strategy. And again, oftentimes in our customer base, like we have sophisticated customers that are thinking of expanding geographically, launching new products to market, moving down market, moving up market. Like those are the conversations that they are having. And hey, we all can have endless conversations about if it's good or bad, but unless FP&A comes well equipped with unit economics by channel, by customer segment, by product, this product in this customer base, in this market, right? And then you start pulling in all this data, not only at the revenue level, but also at the unit economic level. like this is our opportunity. I see a lot of opportunity for us with this project-based accounting or shallow P&Ls to really drive these more meaningful decisions and then help the business close more doors and focus and deploy resources where it truly matters, right? And multiply the effect of guys. Like it's data showing us that, right? Like we need to invest heavily.
Yeah, 100% agree. I know we're right at the hour, so I just say finance is a support function. We don't set the strategy. We don't ultimately make the decisions, but we can help provide the information, have sometimes those difficult conversations that help make the business make better decisions. That's really what we're there to do. And we can see that in the financial results. And we can see that in the way our business trusts us. And so the budget, our goal is to help the business make the best decisions it can to achieve its strategy. And that's how we need to keep it in focus during the budget season. Because the reality is we're all going to get those times where it's like, this is what we're doing, figure it out. And we don't know of a path to get there, or we may not like it. We voice our opinions, then we do the best we can. That's the reality. We've all been in that situation in FP&A. I know I have, where I'm like, all right, well, I told you so. We were never going to hit those numbers, and we didn't. But you still got to do your best to support your business leaders.
Unfortunately, Paul, we are on time. As always, it's been a blast to be chatting with you and learning from your extensive experience in the industry. And obviously, you work with many teams out there. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for having me. It's always fun to chat with you, Julio. I really enjoyed it and love the engagement we got and just people coming from so many different places. So thank you for taking some of your time to chat with us today.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining. Looking forward to the next one. Bye.